To start, I'd like to go over what traditional knowledge is, as it's a term that you may not know. Traditional knowledge is knowledge that has been gathered by the Indigenous people of various lands over the past hundreds of years on their own specialties. It is a broad term which can relate to the medical properties of plants, the understanding of migration of the animals in a local region, how to maximize the environment for the resources while still maintaining a healthy ecosystem. Traditional knowledge has contributed to many different things. An example such as on this slide is aspirin, which has helped develop modern Western medicine. Despite this, traditional knowledge is commonly challenged by scientists, as it isn't seen as a quantifiable data or necessarily a truth of how the world works. This has caused traditional knowledge to be dismissed by the scientific communities or seen as a myth, as it isn't quantifiable. But traditional knowledge can bring a lot to the scientific community and help us learn things about the past, the present, and the future of science. As you can see on the slide, we have corn, squash, and beans. These plants are the three sisters, which is an agricultural technique used by the Indigenous people and created by them. How it works is each plant are grown together in a single crop, which is quite different than modern crops, which are mostly just a single plant. They use the advantages of all three different plants to work together. The corn provides as an older sister, being like a support for the plants. The beans curl around the corn and bring nitrogen into the atmosphere, down into the soil, providing more sustenance. And then the squash staying at the bottom and provide shade for the soils so it stays nice and moist. But they also have prickly stems and such that cause it to protect the plants from raccoons and other predators. This is an example of traditional knowledge in the food system and the maintenance of a healthy ecosystem that uses the preservation of biodiversity to its advantages. Today, corn, squash, beans, potatoes, and peppers are some of the main few vegetables that contribute to global cuisine. But as we stray away further from traditional knowledge, it has led to over half of the crops in the world to be either corn, wheat, or rice, which doesn't use the whole idea of a balanced ecosystem in our crops.
So continuing on, before moving forward with our workshop, I would like to continue to take a minute to acknowledge that the following discussion deals with sensitive topics and distressing themes, including violence against Indigenous communities. This conversation may provoke feelings of anger and frustration. And just as a reminder, this is an open community, and our goal is to facilitate respectful discussion and learning as we, as I mentioned earlier when we started our workshop presentation, as we continue to acknowledge that we are settlers on this traditional and ancestral unceded land. It is also important for us to learn some of the challenges Indigenous communities face. So we are by no means experts on this topic. Just as you are here to learn, we are continuing to learn also as we'll explore new ideas and topics relating to Indigenous communities. For this workshop, it was developed with in collaboration with our Indigenous advisor within LFS. So without further ado, let's explore the restriction of cultural foods in Indigenous communities through a case study on the lobster protest in Nova Scotia. So for Indigenous people, nature is a living entity in which humans have reciprocal responsibilities. Therefore, for some Indigenous communities, fishing is a significant part of their culture and identity. And in 2019, the Fisheries Act was modified to reflect the reconciliation. So this act is meant to uphold the rights of Indigenous peoples of Canada. First Nations have the right to traditional and customary governance of traditional lands, waters, and resources, including fisheries. However, in Nova Scotia, non-Indigenous commercial lobster fishermen protested against the Indigenous lobster fisheries rights, which led to conflicts. So in 2020, commercial fishers complained that the MIKMAQ owned traps were illegal due to being placed out of season. The federal government affirmed that the MIKMAQ have a constitutional right to fish in pursuit of a moderate living. So this conflict hinges on Indigenous rights versus federal conservation measures, which divide the coastline into lobster fishing areas, also limits seasons and controls licenses and traps. So the MIKMAQ chiefs declared a state of emergency due to political unrest in the mainland of Nova Scotia. The news release was released, which read, this decision is in response to the violence occurring over MIKMAQ fisheries across the province. So while Indigenous people, we can see that while Indigenous people exercise their right to fish for a moderate livelihood, recognized by courts 20 years ago, lobster fishermen protests restrict this right. So as time went on, the situation escalated and turned violent, leading to lobster pound raids, arson threats, etc. for multitude reasons. The conflict saw Prime Minister Justin Trudeau and other political figures publicly speak about ending the violence, but there were no immediate or direct actions taken on investigations to end violence. Another is the lack of recognition to the legitimate rights of the MIKMAQ Treaty for conservation reasons. It is very important to uphold and acknowledge Indigenous people's rights for continuous reconciliation. So the removal of, in response to this, the removal of lobster dishes in most dining places was a move to show solidarity with MIKMAQ and to condemn the ongoing violence stemming from the lobster protests by most restaurant owners or food-owned places within Nova Scotia. And a quote from a local restaurant owner reads, "We don't agree with violence, with oppression, racism, or acts of vandalism." The lobster boycott was their way of taking a stand and pushing the conversation and applying pressure to the groups to involved to find a solution towards this conflict. So the second photo shows the rally in Halifax. Hundreds of residents showed up to the rally to support MIKMAQ during the dispute. This discussion, and it really shows how the community was standing together and helping, standing by the Indigenous people within Nova Scotia. So this discussion only scratches the surface and mildly explores the complexities of ongoing conflicts between Indigenous communities, their rights and reconciliation, and the combination of priorities of the government and settlers on this unceded, ancestral and traditional land of the MIKMAQ peoples. It is important to note that lobster exports from Nova Scotia are delivered to more than 60 countries and account for about 1.2 billion in revenue. The non-Indigenous fishing industry is a major contributor to the economy, which risks undermining the inherent rights, needs, and way of life of Indigenous people for capital. So having a look at this, we can see that food is not just a basic need that we all need for survival, but it's also connected with social life and a lot of, from taking a look at this, like restrictions, conflicts, and a lot of tension with towards respecting Indigenous rights as seen in the lobster protests. We invite you to sit with, however, uncomfortable emotions and to continue to educate yourself on Indigenous people in Canada and around the world. Include Indigenous people in discussions on and learn their ways of knowing and being, and recognize their role also in conservation. And an important highlight, I'm always amazed by this. I learned this just last summer. Although like they comprise less than 5% of the world population, Indigenous peoples protect 80% of the Earth's biodiversity. So they hold so much knowledge and there's so much to learn from them. So continue building public awareness of some of the challenges facing Indigenous communities, and there are various resources you can find to help you learn more about the different challenges that they face.